So today I have with me Aman Ullah, who is the host and one of the main protagonists of the EON Podcast, a dual language podcast in English and Urdu that covers issues of politics and culture. And today I want to talk to Aman Ullah about Islamic militancy. I think it's a subject that you're pretty familiar with. I was talking to you about it earlier. And I even told you, I mean, not just about Islamic militancy, you're pretty learned in history and politics more generally. I remember I was getting some books about the history of the subcontinent, and I told you that I'd rather actually sit with you and learn from you as opposed to read these books.
That's very kind of you.
And then I think the topic of Islamic militancy is a very live topic right now because as we're seeing, there is a live ongoing Israeli attack and assault on Gaza and on Palestine, and there's the Islamic militancy in response to that, including both Hamas and Hezbollah. And we also have Syria, where we have international Islamic militancy operating in Syria, although some argue that it might go in a more localized national direction. But let's start with some history because our program is about the intersection of history and current events. I'm curious to know about the history of Islamic resistance and rebellion and militancy in the subcontinent. I think you're pretty familiar with what was happening in the 19th century in response to the British, and we have what the Indians and the Pakistanis call the first War of Independence, but what the British sources call the Mutiny. So can you enlighten us a little about the Muslim rebellion or the Muslim element of the mutiny against the British?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me on the show, first of all. Big fan, especially since I watched the episode with Sharakhzadeh. I've always been a fan of that guy. But the thing with Islamic militancy in the subcontinent is that the subcontinent and Central Asia, the states or the emirates, or in Urdu we would call them Rajwade, that were formed in different territories beyond the realm of the Abbasid Caliphate or the Ottoman Caliphate. Because in sort of Sunni traditional Islam, which these regions have been dominated by, specifically a very Hanafi strain of Islam in Central and South Asia, because we have a very common, we come through the veil of Persian Islam, but the commonalities are Central and South Asia.
And you're saying of the four Sunni mazhabs, the Hanafi
mazhab is the most popular here, and then we have a lot of commonalities in the way we formulate law. A lot of the leadership class was coming from Persianized Central Asian warlords in South Asia. You had Afghans, you had Turks, you had Kipchaks, you had Mongol converts to Islam coming here. So you had all kinds of Central Asian, Persianized in culture, but part of the Islamicate sort of languages and cultures. And that was sort of the lens and framework by which we viewed our position in history, in South Asia at least. And the legitimacy that these kind of small emirates or these small sultanates derived their legitimacy, they always derived it from the Arab caliphates, from the Abbasids, and then eventually the Mamalik, the Mamalik Sultanate, the Mamluks, and then eventually they even paid homage to the Ottoman Caliphate. Again, the homage was it was performative, and there would be gifts or taxes every major raid or any city that was conquered. Some sort of gift was, but lawmaking and everything was sort of their own prerogative and initiative. And these warlords were not launched by the caliphate. They would only seek legitimacy from the so-called central capital in Baghdad or in Istanbul or wherever.
But so they look more towards them as opposed to Iran.
Yes, of course. At this point, the Safavid Caliphate, the Safavid Sultanate was one of many Turk sultanates or Central Asian sultanates that were expanding into the Levant, into Persia, into Central Asia, into Oceania, or into South Asia. And and I think that the Sunni aspect, the Sunni element of these sultanates found legitimacy with the Caliphate. With any form of the caliphate. But eventually that collapsed as well. The Ottoman legitimacy was challenged by not only Timur, as your audience might know him, but also by the Safavids. And again, it's a lot of history, but the point is that they never really saw themselves as independent from the rest of the Muslim world. And the evidence for that is, for example, that when the Ottoman Empire was being decommissioned by the British Empire and it was being colonized, the Ottoman territories, the biggest movement for the Ottoman Caliphate started in South Asia. It was called the Khilafat movement. It was led by two very prominent brothers who were scholars and intellectuals, who in fact, there was very famous, in the Sunni world, it's a very popular events, by the way. At the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, the South Asian subcontinent provided a lot of wealth, a lot of manpower and resources, and they made a mass migration via Afghanistan all the way to Turkey. Of course, the migration was stopped midway. A lot of people died on the journey. There was a lot of chaos and a lot of embarrassment involved with that particular episode. But the sentiments were there to this day, which are reflected in our relationship with Turkey, or whether that be on a state level within Pakistan or a cultural level. Turks generally have an admiration or some kind of endearment for Pakistanis and Indians.
And remind the
Muslims.
audience, so when you're saying the Khilafat movement and the
Yes.
migrations that took place,
Yes.
what year was this? What?
This would be at the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate.
First World War.
The First World War. The First World War, the 19. So that era was marked by because that was the era of that had, again, I jumped ahead a bit, but that was from the transition from the War of Independence, from a violent struggle to more of a political or activist style struggle that had come about in the 1900s. And that collapse was universal because in the 1850s, in the 1800s, generally from the Sudan, from the Mahdi revolution all the way to the War of Independence within South Asia, within India, the overwhelming collapse that the Sunni Muslim world faced in face of the occupying forces and their superior European weaponry or machinery, whatever you want to call them. We never recovered from that, really, honestly. And it is after that you find that both the British and French occupations, generally across the board, became more inclusive towards their subjects. So a lot of the schools and universities that you will find in South Asia, both India and Pakistan, were developed right after the War of Independence failed, right after the Great Mutiny, because of the sort of realization that we need to start including not just a particular hand-picked, urban elite, but also a larger class of people need to be involved with civil services, with the military. And then you see that subsequently, both in World War I and II, you had huge British Royal Indian regiments who even went on to fight the Ottomans, some of them. And some of them even performed in the East Myanmar sort of belt against the Japanese. Even in Dunkirk, for example, the very popular British film that might have been seen by your viewers.
Yeah.
A lot of the soldiers were British Royal Indian Regiment soldiers.
That's
They didn't
right.
show that in Pakistan and India. You can go anywhere, in any historical building, and you'll always find a mural for soldiers, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus lost in the Great Wars.
Yeah, there's actually a
Both of them.
small Sikh population in Iran now, a very small population. I think they
Right.
have a temple too. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think their forefathers go back to what you're talking about with the
Without
British
a doubt.
Army coming.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
There are Punjab regiment, the Pashtun regiments, Baloch regiments, all different. So the British, what they did was, after the War of Independence and its failures, which for your audience, the Islamic sort of characteristics of it was that even the Hindus and Sikhs involved in the mutiny, they elected to choose the Mughal emperor, the deposed Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar II, as the symbolic leader for the movement. And they still wanted that sort of reflected glory of Mughal rule. Because the British had very successfully employed a divide and conquer strategy where they took smaller sultanates and fiefdoms and made them fight amongst each other to weaken the Mughal Empire. So even after all of that about 100-year period of strife, people still recognize Mughal excellence, that sort of the objectivity that Islamic culture had brought to the subcontinent, which was strife with a very brutal caste system and a class system. So, for example, the masses who are Muslims today in India and Pakistan will not have any high-born family names. They'll be low-born people, because Islam offered a refuge for the lower castes in a very brutal caste system in South Asia for an egalitarian society. Again, the British tried to ape off of that success and promote a certain brand of Christianity very loyal to the British Empire. And it found some, foothold in Pakistan and India. And you have Christian communities here.
So the Dalits, some of them converted to Christianity
yes, of course,
for social
because
mobility.
The new sort of I don't want to offend any audience members, but there's like sort of the Abrahamic or monotheistic sort of, all men are equal in the eyes of God, sort of the Abrahamic laws, and that allowed for, and again, a mercantilist or a capitalist type society that the British were trying to push. The idea was that you could work hard and that you could, have upward mobility, and that if you are rewarded with wealth, God is, favoring you. And so it was a mix and match of religiosity, of social mobility, as well as economic opportunity. But unfortunately, they didn't always. So in the Punjab, there's a big population. In Khyber, there's a big population still in Pakistan. I would say they're a fairly successful minority in Pakistan, given all the oppression or suppression that minorities do face in Pakistan from time to time. They're a fairly successful minority. The British did secure them a lot of high schools, a lot of universities and colleges. They left them a lot of big churches and hospitals. It was the same model as the Catholics, by the way. And they had both strains, which is very strange. They had both Catholic proselytization as well as Protestant proselytization. So there's a split between the Pakistani Christian population. Some of them are Catholics and some of them are Protestants. But now the evangelicals are dominating since the Americans have come into the game. And the Americans are spending big money on on these preachers who speak in tongues and they heal and all these kinds of characters. So now a lot of... So I'm waiting for the first Pakistani Christian Zionist. Let's see.
To emerge.
Yeah. We're waiting for him.
No, what I mean, talking about the European colonialists building alliances or privileging the religious minorities, I mean, that happened in the Ottoman world too, where the Jews and the Christians would often get the best
Of course, this
deal.
is a very typical sort of divide and rule kind of policy. I think the reason why the War of Independence had such a Muslim characteristic to it also was because the British recognized us as the primary opponent to be defeated in the subcontinent, because there was a sense of pride, there was a sense of ownership over the subcontinent, the poetry, the literature, the architecture at that time, the art, popular culture. It was defined by Islamic sort of culture, which
and Persianite culture.
Which led to the rise of Urdu. Even Arabic comes through that sort of Persian lens here, or Arabic literature as well. And that identity was so even, for example, Ranjit Singh, who allied and cooperated with the British, who was a Sikh warlord, who made the first Sikh empire, which is based off, the blue flag that they have with the symbol in it. All that imagery comes from a very specific period of turmoil when the Mughals and the British and all these different castes of characters were fighting. Anyways, the point is that even the highborn, Sikh warlord who establishes this empire, he speaks Persian. His diwan is in Persian. All of his poetry is in Persian. So even the high cultures who were not Muslim would be participating in Persian or Persianate culture.
Of course.
They would have to be speaking Persian, learning Persian, or Persian adjacent languages, which would, like Urdu, for example, which is which is sort of the court language. Again, Urdu had two versions. There was more of a court version, and there was more of an informal version. But still, you had to be learning Persian or Persian culture. It was I mean, look at the clothes. Look at the clothes, look at the food, All the Shahi food for the courts was Persian or Central Asian, Persian/Central Asian.
Right. And I mean, I think what's really strange is that a lot of these Persian foods, like rogan josh, they remain in the subcontinent, but then Iranians don't make them anymore. It's too spicy for them now.
Yeah, I think that, you guys need to... There needs to be a repatriation of some of the culinary delights that the Persian culture has created.
Definitely.
Like jalebi, zalabia, and biryani to fry. They fry the onions to make the base of the rice. Abgush. A lot of dishes. Most of the stuff that we eat is from that belt of Iran all the way up until Central Asia. And of course, there's a desi sort of a flavoring or a spin to it. But a lot of the food, I think, can... I mean, one of our friends, Mustafa, was mentioning that in Iran, whenever there's like a desi restaurant, all they do is they don't use the actual spices. They just put a lot of red chili in the food.
Yeah, exactly.
And they just make it really spicy.
The same with the chai. Like, I don't know what they put in it, but I think maybe extra ginger or something.
Just make it spicy.
But yeah, they make it so spicy that you can't even drink it. So I think, I mean, this is funny because I have some Iranian friends that I took to an Indian restaurant in Iran. And then the next morning they called me and they're like, we passed out from how spicy the food was.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So yeah.
I can imagine. Have you passed out yet in Pakistan?
No, I'm very much, I love South Asian food because I've been eating it for so long that I'm used to it. I mean, I do want to say this though, that if you're eating it every day, especially outside food, my stomach does get a little bit upset.
The dairy will throw an odd curveball once in a while.
Yeah.
It's the same for us, man. We can't eat out all the time either.
Yeah, that's true.
It's the food itself, and also the food handling is kind of bad.
No, definitely.
But then, there's a saying in Urdu, jitna ghaliz, utna laziz, which means the more disgusting, the more delicious it'll be.
The like a hole in the wall kind of place.
Yeah, the hole in the wall, it'll be kind of dingy, but, the food will be great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that sort of cultural identity became the centripetal theme the centripetal force in the revolution, in the revolt against the British Empire, and Bahadur Shah Zafar was the symbolic figurehead, and the Red Fort in Delhi, he was brought there, and the idea was that we would rethrone him as the Mughal emperor. And then when he was caught by the British, they stripped his sons naked. They molested his daughters. They chopped their heads off in front of him, and then he was punished and he was sent off to, I don't know what you call the Andaman Islands in English. We call them Kala Pani, which means black water. It was a prison colony for the British, and all the Muslim leadership was sent there. Either they were executed, or if they had some symbolic value, then they were sent there to die and languish in hard labor.
Yeah. I mean, because I do.
Andaman Islands.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand. I mean, it's a pattern because I do Iranian history, and in Iranian history, what's interesting is Reza Shah, who's the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty.
Yes.
He comes to power through British encouragement, so he orchestrates a coup that eventually overthrows the Qajar dynasty in 1925.
Yes.
And then by 1941, when they think that he has German sympathies and they become suspicious of him, and they also want to secure the oil fields in the Khuzestan province, they actually force him to abdicate, and they send him to Mauritius, which is an island in the Indian Ocean. So, I mean, he got a more dignified treatment because...
he was originally an asset. Bahadur Shah Zafar was not an asset. Bahadur Shah Zafar was a threat, was an active threat.
Yeah.
So the Andaman Island punishment, I completely understand the pattern, by the way. But the Andaman Island punishment was tough. Most religious scholarship went there. It basically, in 1857, you take a society, like a civil society with its civil structures like Waqf. Waqf is very popular in South Asia, by the way.
The endowments.
Endowments, basically. You take the endowment culture, you take any civil infrastructure, the masjid, the madrasa, whatever it is, the hauza, whatever you want to call it. The khanka, we had big khankas here, where the Sufi mystics would take up students and sort of teach ethics and philosophy to average citizens. You take those structures, you destroy them, you level them. You take the physical human beings, the human resources involved with running all of these structures, the scholarship, producing the literature, and you slaughter them en masse, because everybody from the western part, most part of India to the easternmost part of India, most Muslim civil society participated in this. So anyone who was a scholar, was an intellectual, was a man of science, was a man of literature, you were dying.
Yeah, and they were trying to create deterrence.
There were mass executions. The statistics are in the hundreds of thousands, the officially recognized statistics. I suspect it was close to 1 million. There was mass executions of old, young, you name it. So in one night, all of that, not one night, but in the span of a year, you lose 200-300 years of Mughal rule and all the culture it produced and all the scholarship it produced and all the civil society it produced in the span of a year. And then you expect, Muslims never really recovered from that in South Asia. And then after that, you had movements like the Sir Syed Ahmad Khan movement, which was, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was a knighted loyalist of the British Empire, who was also a Muslim political figure and leader. So as a political leader, he was very sincere to the cause. But as an academic, he got very affected by Orientalist thought. Obviously, after the defeat of 1857 and across the Muslim world, this mass defeat, even the Mahdi in the Sudan, the Mahdi in the Sudan?
No, yes.
It's absolutely defeated. So this absolute slaughter in front of European machinery was, I'm sure and the turn of the century was coming. I'm sure these For some people, it elicited, the feelings of the end of times. We have the end of times cult. We have the Ahmadiyya, which is a cult that was formed around the end of times, the millennialism. And then on the other hand, you had more modernist Enlightenment thinking cults, not cults, but movements that started with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan.
And cult doesn't necessarily have a derogatory meaning in like academic literature.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. No, but this was less cultish. It was not cultish even in the academic sense. It was more of an intellectual movement, the enlightened moderation thinking. So as an academic, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan started denying miracles and angels and the Islamic metaphysics, and a lot of it was literalism and materialism, and we have to study the white man's science and the white man's language, and you know the rest.
Sure.
It was very popular. He is considered as one of the heroes of the Pakistan movement as well, by the way.
And he was knighted too.
And he was knighted because he saved some during a mutiny. He saved British families. So he was. So he's not financially corrupt. He's not an evil man. He's not somebody doing this for personal gain. He's a genuine Muslim representative, and he's doing what he thinks is best. It just happens to be that his mindset is so colonized, and to no fault of his own, which is why he has a very sympathetic status in Pakistani academic circles. And I too am sympathetic to him.
And I mean,
because he just witnesses the slaughter of Muslim civil society. And what he sees is that the Hindus are now being promoted as the new sort of elite within subcontinental society. And they have a grudge against Persian and Muslim culture and Muslim society because of this 800-900 year period of ruling. So in that divide and conquer policy, the British pitted us against each other very well. And in that pitting of us against each other, the Hindus ended up taking more, and because there was a resistance in Muslim society to taking up English, to taking up science, to going to study for college, to taking up British education, or for going to civil service or military service, the Hindus started to take first priority. So as a response to that, people like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan are like, guys, we have to double down on this British stuff. We have to participate in Indian civil society. But at the same time, he also proposes the two-nation theory. He is the first guy who does that, by the way, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So he's a very a confused academic, but like a good social political leadership for the Muslims.
No, I mean, what I was going to say that we're very prepared to judge the modernist figures in the 19th and the early 20th century. But I think that if I was in that situation, faced by the shock and awe of colonial modernity, I would have probably asked to copy some European things. And
So. Look at us now. What have we done in the face of post-modernity? No, not much really. And those guys who are dealing with the OG sort of colonial, so I can imagine. I'm very sympathetic to them. But that sort of changed the course of violent struggle for the subcontinent then. After that, we have not had any major incidents of violent struggle. Minor, yes, but not any major ones. And then it became a matter of time to sort of wait out the British Empire. And World War II was it. There's a joke that our Mohsen is Hitler. The joke in the subcontinent is that Hitler's our best friend, because if he doesn't cripple the British economy, they don't leave India. And the Hindutva right wing in India tries to present a delusion about how they were organizing and they were making the people's militia, and we were just about to kick the British out, and that's a bunch of BS. It's a bunch of retroactive rewriting of history because they want to present themselves with a more martial history, even though they don't have one, to try to justify some sort of emasculated version of their past that they have, which I think is just the wrong lens of looking at history. But we were nowhere close to any military success in the 19th or 20th century. The British left because the British economy collapsed.
And so
the British military was crushed, and the new order, starting from World War II and cemented in the Suez, was America's world. And the British were much more focused on the Cold War and on their own domestic territories, so they couldn't deal with India anymore.
Right. And so speaking of that, so you're saying that from the first War of Independence in the middle of the 19th century...
There were other mutinies. There was the first would suggest that there was a second and a third. There were smaller mutinies, but none worth mentioning.
Nothing that major.
None.
And
I
it
mean, sometimes they were big in numbers that the mutineers were successfully able to attack, X number of British officers or civilians living in cantonments or colonies, but they weren't national scale affairs. And they all ended pretty tragically. So slowly the violent activism or the Islamic militancy was phased out, because all of this was militancy, by the way. Because prior to this, they would have had more formal war. So as to your original question, the rise of Islamic militancy comes when there is a vacuum of leadership. When the Mughal Sultanate is taken away from the subcontinental Muslims, they turn to militancy, to guerrilla work, to fighting as mutineers, as ex-members of the police force, or as military men who rebel or whatever, or as street guerrillas, or one of the most active forms. I'll tell you a small anecdote. The biggest forest, the man-made forest in Asia, is right here. By the way, it's an hour drive from the city, and hopefully after Ramzan we can go there for like a picnic or something. It's now the fourth or fifth biggest man-made forest. It's sort of dwindled over the years. It's called Changa and Manga. Changa and Manga were the nicknames of two dacoit brothers who were thieves, who were highway robbers. And they were Peter Pan characters, real. They used to steal from British railways, and they used to distribute it amongst their villages. And the British sort of understood that they had a folklore, sort of human value to the local public. Eventually they were caught, and they were executed at the point where the forest is in public. That's where their villages intersected. And in their honor, the British made the biggest man-made forest in the world at that time, and they made a school there which trained people on animal husbandry and horticulture and how to raise forests and trees and plants. So they wanted to create like a young scholarship program or something for young people to not get involved with militancy. And they honored them. This is the peak of the relationship between the British and the local populace. It's between World War I and II. They had become very integrated. They were speaking the languages.
So they executed them, but they also wanted to honor them.
They also honored them because they understood what this was.
Right.
So they had become part of and this is where I would say the fully native should come from. The term probably comes from. A lot of British officers became fully native. So you would have British officers who had superior officers who were from the subcontinent. And you would have a colonel, and a major who was a British white officer would be serving under and this is between the World War I and II. Up until World War I, it was mostly Sipahi service. It was mostly like foot soldier service. But eventually they opened up. You have most of the leadership for the subcontinent coming from Cambridge and Oxford and Aligarh and these big institutions that were set up by the British, or at least tolerated by the British. And that cross-pollination starts after the near the World Wars, where you have lawyers and intellectuals and social workers and doctors going to the UK and coming from the UK. And our history with the United Kingdom starts in the late 1800s, where in the proper sense, where we were visiting the mainland, England and what have you. Having diplomatic exchanges, and we're no longer as Oriental as the rest of the Orient. Right. If that's a way of
yeah. No, and so we're coming up closer to independence in 1947. Yes. So could you also, because our audience doesn't know much about South Asian history, so could you briefly tell us who was the Muslim League, and what was their relationship to militancy?
So
Did they approve?
You had Congress. You had Congress, and Congress was the overarching representation of subcontinental sentiment, and most Muslims and most Muslim leadership was with the Congress party. Like for example, the Deoband, the Bareilly, most religious schools, they were with the Congress. The Congress had some people who were some intellectuals, so Iqbal Lahori. I'm sure the Persian audience knows of Iqbal Lahori. Iqbal Lahori was opposed to the Congress. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the eventual founder of Pakistan, Qaid-e-Azam. He eventually also opposed the Congress and went into exile in the UK because he felt like he couldn't work with them.
And Iqbal persuaded him to come back.
And Iqbal went in the UK and persuaded him to come back. Pakistan had a lot of support from the landed class, from a lot of the landholding class, because they feared that India would be brutal in shutting down and breaking up their land holdings. What do you call that? Nationalization? No, what would you call it?
Breaking up the land holdings?
Yeah, there's a word for it. It's an actual term for it.
Like appropriation of land? Or?
Yeah, something like that. Because a lot of the fiefdoms that people had at that time were grants from the British, or they were illegally begotten, or whatever you want to call them. So a reappropriation of the land would have led to a lot of downfall, a lot of major households. So there was that kind of nefarious crowd that supported. That was one of the power groups that supported Pakistan. The industrial base supported India. The industrial bases that the British had set up, they were supporting Congress and subsequently the idea of a united India. Eventually, Quaid-e-Azam was convinced that there was no joint cause with the Muslims and Hindus, because the Hindu leadership within the Congress had suggested many a times that they would not allow any sort of independence or any sort of private family law. They would try to universalize the acts of citizenship and what have you. And there was an element of revenge in the air, where like the Hindu elites at least had a perceived vendetta against Muslim society, because again some of the more extreme elements were convinced by religious ideology that the foreign people were called Muslims are called Malich in Hindi. Malich is like a slur. It would be like the N word, or and that where it both connotates foreigners and someone who is impure. So I think the idea is that we're an impure people on a pure land, and they also recognize the fact that parts of Pakistan that would be today's Pakistan are just not historical India anyways, like Khyber and Balochistan. They're a completely alien cultural identity, more of a Persian or a Pashtun or an Afghan identity. So there was an element of that there's a different kind of Muslim identity within the subcontinent that now holds a fair amount of the territory in the subcontinent. So the Muslim League was not a militant organization. It was a mostly political organization sanctioned by the British and within the fair mandate of the British Indian mandate. And they operated like any other political party, but they were not very popular before Quaid-e-Azam's shift to them. Again, a lot of the great Muslim intellectuals like Abul Kalam Azad, Maulana Hassan Ahmad Madni, they all stuck with Congress till the end. But in hindsight, I think they were not. They were wrong. They were wrong. I think the demand for I think the way it happened was incorrect. There was a lot more territory that Pakistan had demanded and did require in fairness. That would have put Pakistan and India at a fair balance. But like with the British, what they always do, they create border problems wherever they go, and they always left colonized territories in a way that they would always keep fighting over some border dispute or some ethnic dispute or another. Look at Sykes-Picot. If you look at the
mandate system.
The mandate system. If you look at the Durand line with Afghanistan, if you look at the Ratcliffe line with Pakistan and India, they don't make sense. Like Kasur is a district which is totally surrounded by India, yet Pakistan has it. And then Sialkot is all the way inside India and Pakistan has it. And none of it makes any sense. Kashmir for the India does not make any sense. A lot of parts of Bengal, UP. So Hyderabad, Pakistan was supposed to become Pakistan, but the Indians, captured it because it's so far away. In fact, there was even a movement to make multiple Pakistans, like an Islamically motivated separate nation for Muslims, but not contiguous territories. So there could be a Pakistan 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. So they would have some defining name, like Hyderabad would be the Deccan territory, and then West Pakistan would be this, and East Pakistan would be Bangladesh, or what have you.
Federation?
Like a confederation of ideologically driven countries, of territories, let's say. There was even those kinds of proposals, but between the British, between the Congress, and between the failures of the Muslim League, you got what you got in 1947, which is one of the biggest and most violent mass migrations in human history.
Right.
And I guess the rest is history.
Yeah. And then, so let's come closer to the present then, because you're saying that Muslim militancy. There was a major Muslim militancy the way we had it in 1857.
Yes, but not in the 20th century.
Yeah. But let's come to the present, so
Yes.
the 21st century. And you mentioned how the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan has a level of it's a little bit artificial.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, can you inform us about the state of Islamic militancy
So
today?
Islamic militancy in Pakistan has a history, and it starts. So if you want to look at paramilitary militancy under the state's ambit, though it's been there from the start. So for example, even when we occupied the territories of Kashmir that we have conquered, we got it through Pashtun tribal warlords. The actual army was not sent there. So that I wouldn't denote it as Islamic militancy, but as paramilitary forces or military adjacent forces that were working under the ambit of the
That just
state.
happened to be Muslims.
That just happened to be Muslims. Islamic militancy truly, I think, arises in the 60s and 70s. 70s in earnest. Up until the 60s, Pakistan is sort of confused about its ideological identity, and the first time you have a very major foreign intervention is the election of General Ayub Khan to be given a double-step promotion. So our premier at that time, Liaquat Ali Khan, was invited on a month-long trip to America, where he was provided with state, guest service and the Air Force One or Two or one of these crafts for a full month, and then he was subsequently sent on another tour to Canada for a full month, and he was really well taken care of. And when he was sent back, he just did one thing: he double promoted a general, Ayub Khan, and made him the chief of army staff, which is the highest honor that you can have in the military. And Ayub Khan had already been slighted by Qaid-e-Azam, by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and his record had been sullied because Qaid-e-Azam had mentioned that this man has political ambitions, and he had given him like a pink slip on his record or what have you. So that was an unorthodox thing, and then that man became the military dictator of Pakistan after the sudden and erratic assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan. So Ayub Khan really it ushers in a new era where you have foreign interventionism. And that initial foreign intervention was a honeymoon period of dams being developed and electrical grids. We had the we talked about this the other day. We had the agri-revolution at that time, the American exports. Some of the citrus we tried, I think we ended up eating some quinus, which are the very nice citrus that we developed in the 60s. That was coming from America. Some of the GMO wheat products and rice products. A lot of stuff came in the 60s. So a car culture developed within Pakistan. We talked about this as well.
Car culture.
So you had Chevrolets and Fords and General Motors coming in at that time. So the 60s were the honeymoon phase of imperial intervention. It was all positive. It started to turn ugly when, to back up the Shah in Iran, we started creating chaos in Balochistan because the Shah needed a problem. And again, this is a very intense detail, but you have subsequently chaos within Balochistan, and that was also not Islamic militancy; it was ethnic militancy. After the assassination of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto by Ziaul Haq, that is when in earnest you get Islamic militancy. That is when you get the Saudi money and the American money in the 70s. Zia was a very cunning military dictator Pakistan had. He was very good with Pakistani foreign policy.
And what did he ruled in the 80s? Can you clarify?
The 70s and 80s, yes. He allowed us to, late 70s, early 80s. And then he allowed us to develop nuclear weapons under the garb of the Afghan Jihad. This is the peak of the Afghan Jihad. As a bulwark against the Soviet Union, he sells, Charlie Wilson's war, the very famous war. Ziaul Haq sells it to the Americans, to the CIA. He says to them specifically, we have to keep the pot boiling in Afghanistan, but not to boil over. And we have to keep it simmering constantly to make it so hot for the Soviet Union that it sort of starts to collapse. And it did in Afghanistan. The Stingers were going through here. A lot of the military equipment was going through here. The training camps were all in Pakistan. And that is in earnest when we become the hub for international Islamic jihad. The Saudis come in. You have Osama coming in at that period. You have Sheikh Abdullah Azam, who was a central character in Salafi jihad. He is a proselytizing sort of Gandalf-like figure, where he goes around to the different kingdoms of men, rallying them against the orcs and Sauron or whatever. And he is, by the way, his cassettes, his tapes are everywhere. And the state also develops their own militia outfits to act as intermediary for the more independent outfits like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They create dependent intermediary outfits locally. You had Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Sipah Sahaba and Lashkar-e-Muhammad and so on and so forth. Another aspect was that the revolution from Iran was also being exported. And we faced our first sort of major sectarian strife during that era as well. So there was a push and pull between the Pakistani state being defensive about the Iranian export of the cultural revolution, of the religious revolution, and a push coming from the more zealous religious community, wanting a Iran-style religious theocracy or whatever, they wanted that kind of equitable society or a more increased Persianized connect. So that push
or more anti-imperialist.
Or more anti-imperialist, yes. That push and pull ended up creating two ends of the militia groups. One that were backed by Iran or at least given, approval of Iran. And on the other hand, they manufactured domestic Sunni groups to combat the Shia activist or militant groups. That was one element of the Islamic militancy which was internal and was sectarian in nature. Again, I wouldn't describe it as militancy. I would describe it as more gang battles, like between street gangs, because that was the scope and scale. It was like, Biggie got hit and then Tupac got hit. And then that was the nature of them, underpasses and overhead bridges. Somebody got shot, It wasn't the scale of terrorism or the scale of street combat or urban combat. It was the scale of gangsterism. Because again, with a lot of these militia groups and the state getting involved, existing crime networks also tend to be the finance or the vehicles on which the religious groups or militant groups are formed. So those sort of lines became a bit divided and blurred. As far as international jihad was concerned, we had groups who were intermediaries between the state and and these groups like Al-Qaeda and what have you. And we had already had a history in the 70s to be exported as fighters in Bosnia and Chechnya and in Sudan and Somalia and where have you, and in the Horn of Africa in general. So that was more from a personal, individual religious zeal that exists all over the Muslim world to participate when their brothers and sisters are in trouble or have some sort of imperial force coming in. But then became mainstream sort of and mechanized under the American imperial formula, where the Pakistani army or the Pakistani state apparatus was the conduit, where we trained them, we armed them, we educated them, we taught them how to fight like a military, we equipped them, and so on and so forth. And then we would handle them, we would manage them. So that is the rise of I would say, 70s.
Yeah, and then so you mentioned that bin Laden was in Pakistan too. So can you tell us why he was staying here and how he was killed?
Pakistan has always been a hub for... Pakistan was a big power player in the 60s and 70s in the Muslim world. Because of its geographical position. It was far away from the Gulf. It could be a power broker for the Gulf countries. And it had a manpower in terms of numbers. We had scientific attitude and a leftover of industrial and educational resources to then support and back that up. We had the strongest air force in the Muslim world. For example, I think our performance in the 60s in the Arab-Israeli wars had led the Arab world to be sort of, look to us for guidance. Our involvement with the early formation of Gulf airlines and economic and industrial systems, like with the Emirates or Saudi Airlines, you name them.
In terms of human resource and technology.
Pakistan built most of the Gulf infrastructure, like their armies and their initially, yes. So Emirates Airline was started by Pakistan. They loaned them airplanes and crew and what have you. Most of the stuff initially was Saudi Airlines as well, and most of the infrastructure you'll get. I mean, Oman is practically occupied by Baloch Pakistanis. They occupy the police force, the military, and what have you. So we were their human resource center, and then ended up with a big cultural. In fact, there's a fun fact for your audience. There is a thing called Yawm al-Wataniya. Yawm al-Wataniya is sort of the national day of Saudi Arabia. And on that day, some older people will know this, that in the 70s, there were some English teachers from Pakistan in Saudi, and the government commissioned them to make them a song.
Oh, wow.
And that song is the funniest thing you will ever hear.
Yeah.
It's called It Started in the Desert. And I'll ask the editing guys to put it in here.
Sure.
I'll give you the link. It's the funniest thing that you can ever see in your life. I'll just give you a chorus from it. It says, it started in the desert. It started in the desert. Nothing in the desert. Only sun and sand in the desert. King Fahad, King, so-and-so.
Yeah.
They started in the desert. And it's about development in the desert and how the Saudis have done it. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
My point is our relationship was like, it was thick. It was thick.
Yeah.
So because all of the jihad culture was Saudi adjacent, was either being tolerated by the state or in some cases being supported and promoted and financed by the state. So Pakistan was a good, jumping pad. They got married here. Arab fighters from all over the Arab world came here. They would get married here. They would settle here. They would conduct business here. Uyghurs. Pakistan has been the only maybe country, I think, other than Turkey, in the Muslim world to host the Uyghurs. The first time the Uyghurs were allowed to go to Hajj, it was from the Xinjiang, is through Pakistan. They would come here, they would live for a year, they would sell their crafts, and then they would go from the money they made to Hajj. And Pakistan had like one of the first Uyghur restaurants outside of China in Islamabad. I think it's still there. Because Pakistan was viewed as the laboratory for Islamic ideology, most of the Muslim world, especially the Sunni world, always found refuge here. We had the most, I think, highest number of Bosnians and Chechens coming here outside of Europe. Palestinians, Egyptians have always come here for education. Sudanese have always come here for education. And so it had a relationship everywhere. Iranians used to come here for education, for medicine and engineering and the like. But this up until the 80s only. And then we started to fall off ourselves. It is... so that militancy became rampant in the 70s and 80s, and it yielded quite a lot of success. Because the Americans it was in line with American foreign policy. The problems arise when Pakistani foreign policy and these militias and their desires and goals and designs, they start going against the American interests in the region.
Right.
And that is the American entry into Afghanistan.
Yeah.
In the 90s, there was a détente sort of state because the Americans sort of jiggled around with the Taliban trying to get them on board. I think it was Halliburton. Halliburton, is that the big oil company? Halliburton,
or is it Exxon? I don't know.
It's one of them.
Yeah.
One of them went, and I think at that time Bush was the governor of Texas, and he was on the board of chairman for that company, and Cheney used to run that company. They went to Afghanistan in the 90s and they tried to jiggery-pogery around with the Taliban. But what they realized was that these mullahs aren't dumb. And they're not going to play ball. They were expecting they would be dumb and they'd play ball. But they didn't. So there was a détente sort of state. And then 9/11, everything changes. Pakistan had lost its relevance with America in the 90s in the Kargil incident. I don't know if your audience is aware of the Kargil incident, but it was an incident. Briefly.
Yeah.
The Kargil incident is an incident where we broke some international law and we violated some rules of engagement and we started a war with India and we didn't admit to starting it. Anyways, it was a big disaster. But the result that came of it, India, who had been very non-aligned up until that point, became threatened and jumped into the American camp for the first time. And it's the 90s liberalization of India, and you saw it opening up. And you saw the apex of that during Obama. Obama is to blame for Hindutva, by the way. Just a random side note for the audience. I think lovable Obama is... Yeah. But anyways, that liberalization starts in the 90s because of Pakistan's silly decision to invade Kashmir at the wrong time. After that, we've done the job. So if Pakistan's job in the region is containment of China or containment of Central Asia or representing US foreign policy goals in the region, once India is in their lap, why do they need Pakistan anymore? They're a bigger economy, bigger population, bigger military force.
Formerly, India had Soviet sympathies, but then you're saying by the 90s.
After the 90s, they start to shift camp. So Pakistan had lost relevancy. In fact, one of the most famous anecdotes, the General Mahmood, who is still alive, who lives in Lahore, by the way, where we are right now, he went 3 or 2 days before 9/11 to negotiate some military contracts with the American and the CIA counterpart, his CIA counterpart. And he was given a cold shoulder. He was snubbed in the Pentagon. And the night of 9/11, the morning which it happened, the night before, he was flying out, but he stayed like an extra night for one reason or another. And then he witnesses it in the morning, and he's summoned back to the CIA. I think it's Brenner was the head of the CIA at that time. He hugged General Mahmood, and Brenner was a large fellow. And
Paul Bremer?
I think so, that's his name. General Mahmood says, I remember my shoulders started becoming wet because when I looked around, he was crying. He said, what can you do for us now? So we get a lease on life from 9/11. 9/11 was the lease on life for Pakistan in terms of our relationship with the Americans. And after that, it soured again very quickly. During the invasion of Afghanistan, they view Pakistan mostly as a Cambodia character in terms of Vietnam. Technically, are their allies against Vietnam, against South Vietnam, against Afghanistan in this case. But we were also underhandedly facilitating the Taliban. We were working with them. In fact, the biggest attack that happened, the Camp Chapman attacks, the biggest attack on Afghan soil against an American troop, it led to 70 Marine deaths, 2 or 3 CIA deaths, and some other military contractor deaths. It's the single most casualty-ridden attack against the Americans ever in their recent memory. It was carried out from Pakistan by the Pakistani Taliban, which was facilitated, aided, and formed by the Pakistani intelligence agencies. So they understood this sort of double game that we were doing. At the same time, the Americans and the Indians would employ the Takfiri militant groups against Pakistan, and Pakistan also faced some of the biggest terrorist attacks at that time because the religious groups had a schism. The religious militants had a schism because when Pakistan decided to participate in the war against Afghanistan, there's a big ideological rift. Do we side with Pakistan still, or is now Pakistan the big taghut of the era, A taghut for the audience is the big, open, rebellious against God entity.
Quranic term.
It's a Quranic term, the big pharaoh of the entity.
They also use it in Iran. The revolutionaries use it against the Shah and the Pahlavis.
He was taghut. Come on, man.
Taghut,
Yeah. So the big taghut becomes Pakistan, and so some of the more milder and more state-controlled elements, they carried on their work as B and C teams of the Pakistani military and intelligence apparatus. The more radical groups like the TTP, splinters of Al-Qaeda, and then what eventually became ISIS in the 2010s, they still to this day find a lot of recruitment in Sunni populations, especially Al-Hadith, which we would call Salafi in English. Not in English, but like Al-Hadith is a Desi strain of Salafism. They're called Ahl al-Hadith here. But we had a state of civil war then for a decade because of the Afghan foreign policy that we decided on. Again, by a military dictator, General Pervez Musharraf. I think we lost about 100,000 civilians and military personnel in that 10 years. And I think we lost something like $10 or $20 billion in our economy. Again, there was liberalization in the 2000s and late 90s when Musharraf came in and the Americans pumped in money. We had 60, 70 banks and franchises open up and cars and what have you. But it's not real. None of the money that comes in from the Americans is ever real.
Yeah.
They give it with one hand and they take it from the other.
So you're talking about this ambiguous relationship between U.S. and Pakistan, and I think the killing of bin Laden was one example of that.
Yes.
So can you tell us, how did that happen?
So Osama bin Laden is still disputed whether that was his body, that he was already buried in the compound, or he was alive. There is no solid evidence to show either or. We'll never know. It's one of those things, like who killed JFK type situations. So he had either passed away naturally because he had kidney problems. He was on dialysis. 2 of the doctors that worked on him, one for his spine and one for his kidneys, they're both Pakistanis. They both live in Lahore. One of them even went to Guantanamo for a brief period. Very famous Dr. Amir Aziz. You can meet him if you'd like, by the way. You can have him on the show.
No,
He does media appearances as well. Really fun guy, by the way.
Yeah.
He was the personal physician for him at one point in time. So if Osama had passed away naturally, he was buried in that compound. That compound was his, definitely. And there was an element of the Pakistani state that was harboring him as an asset. Someone was paid out. Someone was convinced that, Osama was no longer valuable to us anymore. And the Americans needed a soft target to say, that Bush moment when he's on the destroyer and he says, what do you say, job well done? After the Iraq war, do you remember when he's on the ship, on the destroyer, and he says, we won, we did it. One of these like Rocky IV type dialogues. Like,
Who says this?
Bush.
Oh, Bush.
In Iraq, after Iraq, he goes on the destroyer, some like USS whatever, and he says, we did it or something. We did it, Adrian. Like he's won Rocky IV or III or something.
Yeah. Obama was similar.
Obama needed a win.
Yeah.
The drone program and all of the foreign intervention needed a justification. They had already killed 2 American citizens in the drone program, Anwar al-Awlaki and his nephew, a Yemeni American citizen. They had killed countless civilians and innocents. And with the rise of the WikiLeaks and other kinds of embarrassments like that, the security apparatus couldn't take it. They needed a big win. They killed this. They purported to have killed Osama.
Yeah. No, but I was going to say, because when Obama announced the killing of bin Laden, he was just so like articulate and well presented. But when Trump was,
Baghdadi.
yeah, it was just so like unhinged.
He died like a
and-
dog.
I know. You do a good. You do a good
They
impression.
showed me the dogs. They said they're beautiful dogs. Yeah, it was ridiculous. Yeah,
You've seen that
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
I know. It's just this is the funniest contrast.
In part 2, once we're done with iftar, inshallah, we will discuss the actual operation and the secrets, the sort of the things you won't hear in the news about the Osama bin Laden operation.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Sounds good.
See you guys in a minute.
All right.
Thank you.